Welcome to the Weekly Leadership Experience, a place for leaders to get inspired, be challenged, and grow. I am your host, Reshad Oberlander. Let's get started. Today's episode of the Weekly Leadership Experience is brought to you by my 7-day Leadership Growth Challenge. It's a free challenge that I've created, and it's delivered by email over the course of 7 days. I've created 7 compelling questions to challenge various aspects of your leadership, the way you lead, and why you lead. Go to ReshadOberlander.com and scroll down until you find the 7-day Leadership Challenge, or look for the link in the show notes. I have a review today from CFF on the Apple Podcast platform, 5 stars, titled Great Lessons That Are Relatable and Applicable. I liked the relation to horse training. What a great metaphor for how to approach team members and leading with authority, yet with kindness. Thank you so much for that wonderful review. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. If you want to leave me a review, you can go to ratethispodcast.com/weeklyleader, and it will take you to your platform of choice where you can go ahead and leave me a rating and a review. I look forward to hearing from you. Let's get on with the show. Hello, leaders, and welcome to the show. I'm so glad you are here today. Today, I'm kicking off a new style of an episode for the show, which you'll see come up every probably 4 to 6 installments. The episode is going to feature a question and answer style episode, but these are going to be the questions that you want to ask. So, get your questions in, and you could see them featured on an upcoming episode, or even be used during a guest interview. You can email your questions to podcast@weeklyleadershipexperience.com. That's podcast@weeklyleadershipexperience.com. So, let's get started. Mike in Red Deer asks, how do you define the word leadership? It's a great question, Mike. And, it seems that every leadership expert and textbook out there has a different definition of leadership. And truly, this leads to a lot of confusion about what leadership is. This may not change, and of course, I have my own definition of leadership as well. But let's answer the question. So here's how I see leadership. First of all, for there to be a leader, there needs to be some kind of a relationship with another person, group, or community. If there's no one to relate to, it's awfully difficult to be a leader. Second, you don't have to be a boss to be a leader. Although a title or position comes with some level of authority, it does not always equate to leadership. People will follow you because they have to, not necessarily because they want to. Third, leadership to me is about your attitudes, behaviors, and actions far more than it is about being a formal leader. Leadership, therefore, can be circumstantial, situational, and permanent or non-permanent. In other words, any person can be a leader in a given moment, while some pursue leadership as a lifelong calling. Finally, I personally believe in approaching being a leader from the philosophy of servant leadership, which at a simple level means that you put the needs of others ahead of your own and focuses on helping your team be better people, not just better employees. So if I had to make a singular statement based on what I've just described, it would go something like this. Leadership is one person choosing to lay aside their own needs in service to another so that that person may become more and accomplish more. Thanks for the great question, Mike. Keep it rolling in. Our next question comes from Andre in Queensland, Australia. The question is, how do you keep yourself motivated on a tough day? Take a deep breath. Andre, I am realizing more and more that we all need to start with more compassion for ourselves. We are all so often too hard on ourselves and engage in way more self-criticism than we would offer anyone else. When someone you care about comes to you and says they are having a tough day, what do you do for them? Do you tell them, "Suck it up, princess, you'll be fine"? Or do you ask what's going on and what you can do to help? Or do you listen to them? Do you offer them a shoulder to cry on? If you do that for someone else, why do you think it's okay to kick yourself while you're down? Give yourself a hard time if you're having a tough day. Tell yourself to get over it. It's all going to work out. Those things may be true. You will get over it. You will be fine. Those other things, but we need to start with self-compassion. So start there. Start with self-compassion. Acknowledge that it's a tough day. You are allowed to have a tough day. Don't tell yourself to get over it or suck it up. Give yourself the time and space to process what's going on. If your to-do list doesn't get done, it's okay. Next, I would say to recognize what is in your control and what isn't. If it's not in your control, I would advise against trying to change it, but rather focus on what you can influence. When it comes to motivation, it's a very broad subject. But if we're talking about how do you stay kind of motivated and engaged in what you're trying to do for the day, whether that's at work or with your team or just getting things done, again, like I said, you got to start with the self-compassion, give yourself the time and the space, recognize what's in your influence and what's not. And if you need to get some things done, what I have found helpful at times when I'm struggling is even just getting a couple of small things done can give you a sense of accomplishment and can help you take a little weight off the weightiness that you might be feeling. You can just take a little weight off just by crossing off a couple of small items on your to-do list, and if all that is making sure there's dinner on the table for the kids and doing some laundry, like, okay, that's done, it's out of the way, got it taken care of, right? So, start small if you need to. Just have a small to-do list, write down the things that you are thinking about that need to get taken care of. Take off a couple of items from that list. If it's not pressing, move it to another day if you have to, right? And, also do some things that just give you some energy back, whether that's going for a walk or doing something that you enjoy, or stopping for a moment to read, or just, taking a deep breath, like whatever those things might be for you. And then come back and refocus. We all struggle on some days. It's if you're not struggling some days, I'd be surprised. Everyone does have that, which is not to trivialize the question and not to trivialize how a person might be feeling. It's tough. There are definitely days where it's tough. But, we all do go through those things. And, another thing is definitely to surround yourself with people who can support you on days that it's tough. So who's in your support network? So I hope that gives you some help. The next question comes from Candace in Florida. And the question is, how do you bounce back as a leader after you've been laid off, quit, or been let go? Well, Candace, fortunately for you, I have experienced all of those things. And it can be tough. I'd like to start by saying, there's definitely different levels of trauma on each of these things. Being laid off, quitting, being let go, or being fired, there's definitely some different levels of trauma. And of course, there can also be different levels of trauma just based on the circumstances of each of those things. What else is going on in your life? What are the circumstances surrounding either the layoff, or why did you quit, or why did you get fired or let go? I think just generalizing a little bit, being laid off is probably somewhat less traumatic than having to quit a job or being fired from it. Although being laid off can still be quite troublesome. This pandemic that everyone has been experiencing around the world has led to many, many layoffs. And many, many people are still out of work because they haven't been able to go back to their industry, or, there's still lockdowns in effect where people are having to stay home and they don't have a primary source of income, or are having to rely on government subsidies or what have you. So that can be stressful and traumatic too. But generally, I would say that quitting a job or being let go from a job, being fired from a job, is definitely somewhat more traumatic than being laid off. Bouncing back from any of these is starts with sort of understanding kind of where you've been and what you're experiencing. And so, kind of acknowledging the trauma that you've gone through, whether it's just the kind of suddenness of the departure from a position, if it's got other circumstances where it was a toxic workplace or a toxic boss, or other circumstances surrounding that. I'm going to say some things that are going to be very similar to the last question. And, when you recognize that there's trauma, you also need to start with that self-compassion that I talked about earlier. You need to start with a little self-love. You need to give yourself a break. You need to stop beating yourself up. You need to stop looking for necessarily what you did wrong, and start accepting that it was tough. Start accepting that it's difficult. And you need to give yourself the time and the space to heal. In a lot of ways, when you leave a workplace, I think that it's a little bit like leaving a relationship, because you've maybe grown attached to the workplace. You've developed relationships with the people there. You've formed a bond. So when you break that bond, it's a little bit like leaving a relationship where, there's that ripping away, that tearing. And so you need to do some time and space to give yourself to heal. Now, as much as I say, having self-compassion for yourself and not playing a blame game, you do need to find the space to accept what your role was in the events leading up to having, quit or been let go. But the reason you accept your role in the events is to recognize what you contributed to that, not to criticize, not to blame, not to give yourself an opportunity for self-flagellation. It's to recognize what you had to play in the events, and if it's something that you need to adjust or grow on, it's a good opportunity for some self-improvement. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the self-compassion. If you're self-compassionate, you recognize what's true, and you don't play into those falsehoods that you tell yourself. So recognize what your role was in the events. And as I was mentioning, you need to give yourself the space to heal from these things. Part of that means stop pressing play on the theater in your mind. And that was something that I struggled with for a period of time in one of my past employment scenarios, and it was difficult because there was a lot of toxicity that I was dealing with, and I kept replaying and replaying and replaying different scenarios or events that had happened, and replaying in my mind all the things I wanted to say differently, or all the things I would say to someone, on that thing or that thing. And it's not overly constructive to do that. Like it's more important to kind of see the events for what they were than kind of keep replaying these fantasies about what you would do differently or how you would respond to someone or what you would do in that situation again. And sometimes that's very difficult to stop by yourself, but recognize that you're hitting the play button on these history events, and you need to shift the focus away to more what you can control. So recognize, again, those were traumatic events probably, but what can you do about recognizing that, acknowledging your role in it, and allowing yourself to heal from it. And in this case, sometimes having a coach or a counselor can help you work through some of those things. As well, having a support network of people that you can rely on to support you and to help you through these things. And realistically, I would say that bouncing back from these things is there is an element of time to it, and there is an element of just allowing yourself to have the space to recover from what's happened. And you will bounce back. You will. But have some love for yourself. Don't just sit there and look for opportunities to blame yourself or to give yourself a hard time, but give yourself some love. Acknowledge the trauma that was involved. Accept your role in the events. Give yourself time and space to heal. And look for the support and the help where you need it. So that's it for this week's episode. Let me know what you got out of today's questions and answers, or send me the questions you have that you would like me to speak about by emailing podcast@weeklyleadershipexperience.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, and share this episode with a friend. Have a great week. In the meantime, stay awesome. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, would you head over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe, leave me a rating, leave me a review, and share this with a friend. It spreads the word and helps the podcast grow. You can also find me on social media at R.E. Oberlander. Until next time, stay awesome.